Prologue. I remember that fateful summer morning. It feels as though it happened only a short time ago, but I know too well that day has long since passed. It seems that the night waits for no pony, not even me. My time here runs short, as the lights around begin to fade. I'm going to miss watching the warm amber sunsets disappear over the vast equestrian plains. Such delicate memories echo through these beautiful mountains of ours. Never will our stories forsake these lands. Forever shall our love fly upon the eastern breeze. Suddenly, the front door is met with a gentle knocking. "Come in," chokes the sickly unicorn. "Good evening, Daddy," greets the yellow Pegasus. The unicorn rustles in his chair. "Hey there, sweet pea, come to see your old man?" The Pegasus slowly approaches the stationary stallion. "Oh, I've missed you so much. I've brought you some tasty things from Ponyville," whispered the kind young mare. "Oh, no thank you, Princess. I'm not very hungry tonight," breathes the elderly stallion. His daughter shoots a concerned look. "Are you sure?" The unicorn gave a weak chuckle. "I'm sure, sweetie, I'm sure," he says, stroking her pink mane. "Come and have a seat next to me, Fluttershy." "Is something wrong, Dad?" asks Fluttershy. "Can I get you anything?" "I just want to talk to you, Sugar," says the father. "I've been thinking about your papa." The Pegasus immediately freezes in her seat, unable to form a complete response. Yeah?" she squeaks. There was a brief moment of silence that overtook the room, which was eventually interrupted by the unicorn. "I remember the day we found you all alone," says the old pony. "Once your papa saw you all by yourself in that vacant field, you were coming home with us." "That was the happiest day of my life," giggles the Pegasus at the sweet memory. "I'm not sure what I would have done if you hadn't shown up." "Well, I'm glad we did." The stallion smiles at his little filly. "Did I ever tell you about how I met your father?" Fluttershy grins meekly. "Well, I think you told me one time, but I was really little." "Is that so?" muttered the unicorn. "Guess I need to tell it again." The Pegasus nuzzles her father. "Mm-hmm." The elderly pony clears his throat and begins, "I remember that fateful summer morning." Chapter 1. Intrusion. Back when I was a naive young lad, I lived with my mother and my sister in Ponyville. I'd never gotten to meet my father, who was killed in a dreadful flying accident when I was just a little foal. Once I graduated from school, I began to wonder why I hadn't obtained my cutie mark yet. For 2 whole years I walked around town with a blank flank. The bullies in town were relentless. I began to enter a wave of deep depression. One day, I had finally taken all I could stand. I decided to leave Ponyville behind me and live the life of a frontier pony. After several difficult goodbyes, I took my luggage and hopped onto a westbound freight train. I went for miles, past many forests and lakes. I stayed on board until the train had to make an emergency stop in the Whitetail Woods. It was then that my moment had come. I knew in my heart that this was going to be my destiny. For once in my life, I was free. I had escaped the bonds of modernity. No more cities, no more roads, and certainly no more bullies. It was just me and the forest. There was no pony in sight for miles around. It was then that realization kicked in. My life was now in my own hooves. I had no pony to look out for me, no pony to care for me. The only companions I had were what Celestia had given to pony kind, the trees and the animals. After the first few months, I had built my own slice of heaven. I had a toasty wooden cabin, a flourishing garden, and all the trees I would ever need. It was just what I had been looking for, a place to call my own. At that moment, it seemed as if nothing could ever go wrong. The best part was that I'd finally gotten my cutie mark, a small hatchet. Life was perfect. After the first year went by, however, things began to change. I began to miss my mother, my sister, and Ponyville. I knew that I couldn't go back, but after the homesickness began to set in, my heart started to ache. Winter was coming. I had an ample supply of firewood ready for the big freeze. I had been stocking up all throughout the fall in preparation for it. However, no matter how much wood I burned, it never seemed to thaw the bitterness that I felt within my heart. I felt so alone that December. I remember wondering about what my family was doing on Hearthswarming Eve. I felt so guilty for leaving them behind. It seemed that, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the empty feeling I had inside. I recall of one night in particular that was especially bad. It was in the middle of January. and there was a massive blizzard that covered the land. Thick blankets of snow painted the landscape, and the naked trees stood lifeless under uncaring sheets of ice. I remember sitting down in this very chair, staring into the red, glowing embers of the dancing blaze. That night, I cried myself to sleep right by the fireplace. It seems, however, that my despair was determined to follow me into my slumber. I was haunted by many nightmares that night, dreams of loss and suffering. I can think of one specifically that stood out above the rest. It was in this dream that I saw my mother and sister sobbing frantically as our old house was engulfed by monstrous flames. I will never forget the sorrow and terror I saw in their eyes that night. It was dark the following morning. There was no sun, and there were no birds singing. There was nothing but a deathly silence consuming the mountainside. As I walked through the skeletal forest, I noticed a trail of rather large paw prints. My initial thoughts were of ravenous timber wolves rummaging for whatever scraps of meat they could find. With fears of carnivorous beasts prowling for fresh prey, I soon began to panic and gallop back towards the cabin. Once I was inside, I began to relax a little bit. The fears of timber wolves quickly evaded me, but were soon replaced by a disturbing realization. There was a very large trail of water leading over to the lit fireplace. As I slowly tilted my head towards the flames, my mouth widened in terror. Laying on the floor was the biggest canine I'd ever laid eyes on. My first thought was to run, but I soon realized that there was no place for me to run to. The beast was inside of my house, and I had to defend it. Using my magic, I picked up the closest axe I could find. I silently made my way over to the sleeping creature. His thick gray fur was soaking wet. It was as if he'd managed to fall into a pond or something. As innocent as he seemed resting on my floor, I knew in my heart that letting him awaken was a great risk to my own safety. I then fired myself up as I slowly drew back the sharp steel blade. At that moment, the dog's eyes opened in a flash. I froze in terror as the large orange eyes looked up at me. Before I could make any movement, he made a desperate sprint out the door into the cold wasteland. I then felt terribly guilty, seeing as the dog obviously had no intentions of malice. He just wanted to shield himself from the outside. Without thinking, I made mad dash after the poor mutt, dropping my axe on the floor. "Hey!" I screamed. "Please come back, I don't mean you any harm." There was no response. I then realized that I had scared him more than he'd scared me. This made me feel even more guilty. "Hey!" I shouted again. "I didn't mean to scare you." After several attempts at trying to call the dog back, I eventually gave up and started to return home. Karma, it would seem, had it out for me at the moment. The last thing I can remember was sliding on a large patch of ice into a tree. When I finally woke up, I found that I was laying in my own bed. Had it all been a dream? Was the dog just another one of my hideous nightmares? It was then that I heard 4 words that I would never forget.
Is Little Pony okay?